Good evening and welcome to the third of what we hope will be 6 forums for candidates for office for November 6th that is being brought to you by Kenan Community College and The Citizen. I'm your moderator, Guy Cosentino. Candidates throughout, can we start over again? Jeff? Good evening and welcome to the third of what we hope will be 6 forums with candidates for office on November 6th. This is being brought to you by Kenan Community College and The Citizen. I'm your moderator, Guy Cosentino. On November 6th, the voters across the state of New York will get to vote for all the members of the New York State Legislature, 63 members of the Senate and 150 members of the Assembly. Kenan County has 3 senators. Senator John DeFrancisco, who represents the 50th District, is retiring this year and covers part of the city of Auburn and areas east. The 51st Senate District is now represented by Senator Jim Seward, and it includes the towns of Owasco and goes along the east side of Owasco Lake, headed down south to Moravia. And we had a forum with him and his opponent last week. Freshman Senator Pam Helming represents the 54th Senate District, which includes the rest of Kenan County, which includes parts of the city of Auburn, points west, and the county northwards. 2 years ago, she faced off in this studio 3 opponents. This year, one of them has returned for a rematch, Rosetown Supervisor Kenan Baldridge. They are both in the studio to answer questions about themselves and the issues facing the district and the state. Jeremy Boyer, the executive editor of The Citizen, who runs a weekly column about newspaper issues and media every Thursday, is here in the studio again to ask questions. Our candidates are sitting in the order of their opening statements, and they are, as I had mentioned, Kenan Baldridge, who is the town supervisor of Rose. He's on the Democratic Women's Equality Party and Working Families line. And Senator Pam Helming is on the Republican Conservative Independence and Reform lines. Welcome back to the studio. We're delighted to have you back here today. As we said, this was done by a coin toss. You'll get 2-minute opening statements. Dante, who is a student here at the college, will be timing you and letting you know when your 2 minutes are up. But we'll start with Mr. Baldridge, who is again on the Democratic Women's Equality Party line and the Working Families Party. Welcome.
Thank you. I'd like to begin by saying thank you to the college and the Citizen for providing the forum for this for this campaign. I'm running again this time because I felt that our senator in Albany has been disappointing us in a couple of ways. One has been either by doing nothing about some very important issues in the 54th District or by actively voting against us. And I'll give you some examples. In terms of doing nothing about a very important issue, we have 3 huge landfills in this 54th District where we take over 5,000 tons of New York City trash every day and dump it on our farmland and pile it up, and that land can never be used for farming again. I think this is a big problem. 80% of New York City's trash comes here. I think that needs to be dealt with more effectively than has been thus far, and in the time allowed soon, I'll offer some suggestions for how to do that. That's one example. Another example is in terms of actively voting against us. The senator has voted, by her own words, has voted to repeal the safety provisions for volunteer firefighters and first responders. The New York SAFE Act provides what's known in common parlance as the West Webster provision, whereby the penalties for shooting first responders was increased up to life imprisonment. And by her own words, she has voted 4 times to repeal that. Now, I'm 42 years in the fire service. I like that provision. I think it should remain in the law. And should not be tampered with. Another part of that law is to take firearms out of the homes where there's domestic violence going on, and she has voted to repeal that. I think that's just wrong, and I would vote to keep it. So I think that these are cases where she's voting against us, and I think that needs to change. So
thank you, Mr. Baldridge.
Stop there.
We'll now hear from Senator Helming, the incumbent. She's on the Republican, Conservative, Independence, and Reform parties. Welcome, Senator.
Thank you. Thank you, Guy, and thank you, Jeremy, for hosting today's forum. For the past 20 months, it's been a privilege to represent you in the State Senate and to work full-time for the more than 300,000 residents who live in my district. A little background information. My husband, Gary, and I have 2 children and a wonderful son-in-law. We're a proud military family. Both of our fathers have served, and our son-in-law is a captain in the Army. My prior experience as a local elected official, along with 30 years of working for private businesses, has allowed me to hit the ground running. During my first term, I sponsored 119 bills. 72 passed the Senate and 25 passed both houses. To give you some perspective, this is the most bills passed by anyone in my freshman class. The Lake Ontario flood relief legislation was one of these bills. This legislation provided a way to help homeowners and small businesses get back on their feet. It was also the largest single award for disaster relief in New York State history. There's another reason why I mention this bill. It is a great example of what can be accomplished when elected officials forget about political differences and work together to address an issue. Last week we heard about another elected official charged with a crime. Many of us are justly concerned about government corruption. I've taken several steps to end corruption, including voting for term limits, stripping the pensions of corrupt politicians, and requiring accountability and transparency from programs such as Startup New York. Over 1 million people have moved out of New York State since 2010. When recently asked why, the governor blamed the weather. He avoids talking about the real reasons: sky-high property taxes and job opportunities. During the budget process, my focus was on pushing back on new taxes and fighting for our fair share of funding. The result of that fight? Saving our taxpayers over $1 billion in new taxes, fees, and unfunded mandates. Securing funding for infrastructure, local schools, workforce development opportunities. I was taught to work hard for what you believe in. I'm proud to be an American, and I believe in this nation and the state of New York. I have been and will continue to be committed to serving you.
Thank you, Senator. We'll now hear from Mr. Boyer, who will have questions for both of you or individually. He can ask them of, again, either both of you. If that's the case, we'll just switch back and forth. You have 2 minutes to answer that. Dante will hold up at 1.5 minutes the yellow sign. He'll keep it held up until 2 minutes are up, and then he'll flip it to red, so we'll finish up. Mr. Boyer, welcome back.
Okay, thank you. Thanks to both of you for coming over for today's discussion, and try to touch on as many a variety of topics as we can get through in an hour. I'm going to start off kind of focused on the local issues, the issues especially here in Cayuga County that are part of what voters here are interested in hearing from, and then we'll get into a few statewide issues. But the first one I want to get into here locally, which actually is a statewide issue too, but it's water quality here in the Finger Lakes, and particularly Owasco Lake and Cayuga Lake. We've seen the harmful algal blooms threatening the public water supply. We've been fortunate enough to not have a do not drink order here, but it's still a major threat, and it's still an ongoing challenge. I asked both of you to evaluate what's been done so far to combat the problem from a state level, and talk about other measures you'd actually like to see implemented going forward.
Okay, we'll start, Mr. Baldridge. You'll go first. You'll have 2 minutes, and then the Senator.
I know that there has been some money allocated for water treatment plants, which is good, but it means that the prevention hasn't worked well enough. And I'm not sure that there's been enough going on at the state level to prevent the kind of, particularly the phosphate runoff that feeds these algal blooms. Much more needs to be done with that. The information is pretty well known in terms of what causes these, not entirely known, but fairly well known. But it takes some money to rectify the problem, but also a lot of cooperation from the people around each lake. That's not something the state can mandate, but it can lead in that direction. Once we get the toxin in the water, only a treatment plant will get it out and make it drinkable again. That's my understanding. And there has been money allocated for that. There's probably going to have to be more. And these are not the only lakes with that problem. We're seeing it in the bays, off Sodus Bay, East Bay, Port Bay. It is arriving. So I think we're on the lead edge of this problem, and we need to get ahead of it.
Thank you. Senator, you'll have 2 minutes on the subject of what's been done regarding water quality.
Okay, much has been done over the past 2 years regarding the water quality. There has been, as my opponent mentioned, a record amount of funding that's been put towards a number of projects. $300 million is in the budget. But I do want to say that I disagree with a couple of things that my opponent said. One is putting all of the blame on the phosphorus. We now know it's phosphorus, nitrogen, and we also know from the Skinny Atlas study that phosphorus didn't even play a role, and still they have blue-green algae. So all indicators are that we need to continue to fund research, and we need to utilize experts that exist. I believe that we have such innovative and creative people right here in the Finger Lakes region who could help us address this problem, and funding is important to them. I think I've worked with the Owasco Lake Watershed Association. We're working on a number of issues. They've brought to me a list of priority funding issues that they would like addressed. We've urged the governor to put more towards our Finger Lakes, and also as far as comprehensive planning, I've put $200,000 for a Seneca Lake watershed manager to bring everyone together on that issue, and I think that's already happening here in Owasco. Owasco Lake is working with the City of Auburn, for instance, to address issues. A couple other key points. In the state budget, we were able to allocate funding for a septic system rebate program, which I think that is a factor in the blue-green algae issue, and also land acquisition. So it would allow municipalities and others to acquire lands for a buffer zone. I also wanted to mention on October 24th at Glenora Wine Cellars, I'll be co-hosting with Senator Tom O'Mara a water quality roundtable with experts from all over the area.
All right, thank you. Anything to follow up with?
No, I think
Okay.
not. Thank you.
You have 30 more seconds.
Okay.
Sorry, we might have signaled you wrongly, so you do have 30 more seconds on there.
I think it's important too that we acknowledge there's a lot of work that's done by our county soil and water districts, and the work they do is great, and it follows the Blue Book standards. But what it doesn't do is, when we implement something, it doesn't measure the water quality after the implementation. So if you think of your home, you want to conserve energy. You think if you replace your front door, that's going to conserve energy. You really need to measure how much energy is that front door saving you. It's the same theory here. It'd be great to work with our soil and water districts and to have them do follow-up water quality testing.
Okay, thank you.
I did want to follow up in one respect, and that's agriculture, and that's a big debate, because agriculture plays a huge role in our economy in this district and really in all throughout the state. At the same time, a lot of people feel that the runoff from agriculture is one of the, if not the leading contributor to the nutrient buildups in some of the lakes. So the question is, do we need to do more to regulate and or enforce regulations already on the books for agriculture?
Senator, you'll go first on this. You'll have 2 minutes.
I think we need to partner with agriculture to come up with solutions. We've put some money into the New York State budget for manure management. There's always more that we can do. But what I've found is you're most successful when you partner with people. When you form those partnerships, you provide educational opportunities. Farmers are the stewards of our land. They want to protect their land as well. They want to protect the waterways. Again, I think we need to work with the farmers. I'm not sure that additional regulations are necessary, maybe enforcement of the regulations that we have, working through Farm Bureau, our Cornell cooperatives, et cetera, to do more to help the farmers preserve our land. I've been working with the state, the governor's office, to get more funding for anaerobic digesters, which allow the recycling of the manure, if you will, prevents a lot of the runoff. So I think there are a lot of initiatives out there. We need to continue to build on those initiatives. Again, we have so many people with so many innovative ideas. We just need to tap into them and continue moving forward.
All right. Thank you, Senator. Supervisor, you have 2 minutes on this subject.
Well, we might actually agree on this one, that I'm not a fan of more regulation, that I'm not sure we can regulate our way to a solution on this. People initially pointed the finger at farmers as the culprits on this. I believe there's some evidence which indicates that it may also be municipal wastewater treatment facilities that are capturing the most important things, but phosphate is getting through. I'm not sure that's a red flag, but it's something that has to be considered more. along with home septic systems. There are several ingredients that are a problem. Phosphate seems to be the prime suspect. But we have to remember that any of the phosphate or other nutrient that makes its way into the water is waste as far as the farmer is concerned. So that's money he spent to benefit his crops. He's not getting the benefit from it. So he has an incentive to cooperate on this, and I'm not sure that the regulation is the best way to go.
Senator, you'll have 1 minute.
So I do also want to mention that I've met with several ag companies. These are agribusinesses who provide fertilizers. They're involved in the development of the tractors and the technology that goes into the new equipment that's being used. So there is less and less that is being applied to the fields, and it's being applied more responsibly in a smart way in an effort to save the environment and also to save the farmers money. I met with a gentleman, I think it was 2 weeks ago, who is developing alternatives to the traditional chemical applications. So again, I think there are a lot of opportunities out there. We just need to keep the discussion moving forward, the funding moving forward. And one thing I want to comment on when it comes to our lakes too, the governor is really, he's picked winners and losers, if you will. He started with 11 lakes that were going to be considered priority lakes. After much back and forth and fighting, Seneca Lake was added. Canandaigua Lake still is not. So I don't agree with some lakes will receive funding and others don't. We all have our issues. The issues are unique to the lakes. We need to study each lake individually.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
Just to
Go ahead.
reiterate,
You have 1 minute.
the farmers have a financial incentive to cooperate on this. It's really a case of where the government can be the facilitator. We have to get everybody in the room. And then the natural incentives will be at play there. We don't need more regulation.
Thank you.
One issue here, specifically in the Union Springs, Springport area, is the Cayuga Nation land into trust application. Now, that's not a direct state issue in terms of the decision on whether to approve that, but certainly the state can weigh in and try to influence what's going on. So I'd like to ask you both your position on what you would like to see happen in terms of the decision that's made on whether to allow a land into trust process to move forward for the Cayuga Nation, and B, what more would you like to see the state do in terms of helping the local community in advocating?
Supervisor, I think you're first again.
All right. I haven't read that application. I'm aware that it was going on, so I don't know the details of what they're asking for. But the whole idea strikes me as really going backwards. I mean, I welcome the Cayugas and the other nations into the fold, but it seems to me when we start carving out enclaves, which a trust would be, then what we're really doing is going backwards. And I don't think that's the way that we're going to get to the future together. So I'm not a fan of that application. I'm not sure what influence the state has on that. Perhaps the governor would have some influence if he chose to use it. But I think that it would be best if we at least did not encourage it.
Okay, thank you. Senator, you'll have 2 minutes on this issue of the land in trust as well as the application.
All right, so I don't know the details of the application, but I always fall back on that if the local elected officials are asking for assistance with a matter, a state senator does have a role and can play a role. I've done a number of letters either in support of or against other Indian land claims, other Indian-related issues. I would do the same with this, but I would take the lead from the community.
All right. Another one is Del Lago. That's a big change in this district since I think we last met, because they opened in 2016. And the question, there's been a lot of coverage about, not meeting the revenue projections that they initially had, and whether they're being unfairly hit because of the Seneca Nation's decision not to share revenue. So the question I have for both of you is, given that Del Lago has indicated they would appreciate some more help from the state to kind of boost up their business, where do you stand on that question?
Okay, Senator, you have 2 minutes on the subject.
Okay. So this question originally, it came up in the media, I believe, when we were in last year's budget session, and I believe the reason why it came up was because in the budget, the governor had put policy that would claw back tax dollars, claw back tax dollars from the racinos. And that set off then the casinos. And what I've learned in my district, I have racinos, casinos, I have the Indian casinos, and I also have the off-track betting. And it's such a delicate balance. You do one thing for one industry, and it changes the scope of the entire state gambling. So I think we have to be very careful with what we do. I'm not in favor of taxpayer handouts to private businesses. I think that in this case, I don't know what Del Lago is asking for. Those negotiations have been ongoing with the governor's staff. But again, I would say that I want to make sure that everyone is treated fairly. So when the governor was proposing the clawback at the racinos in the budget, that would have jeopardized over 1,200, 4,000, who knows how many jobs in my district. So it was important to fight on behalf of the racino, and that's what I did. And I don't know if that's what triggered Del Lago coming in. I think it had something to do with it, but that was all about sticking to the commitment that you made. You can't claw back money on a business that you have a commitment with. You said you're entitled to this, 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 and you're going to owe the state this, this, and this. After the business negotiates contracts with union employees and everyone else, I don't think it's right for the governor to go back, like I said, and try and claw back the funding.
Okay, thank you. Senator Supervisor, on this issue of Del Lago.
Thank you. Well, first of all, you probably know I'm already on record as opposing the Del Lago as voted for in the Wayne County Board of Supervisors. I think I was the only one. Economists have shown us before that casinos are not economic engines for a region. They are money transfer. They're wealth transfer machines. They transfer wealth from the poor to the rich and from the rich out of town. And the fact that Del Lago is not meeting their goals on that is not an impetus for any kind of subsidy. We don't know what their goals are. Maybe they want 1,000% profit. I certainly don't want to vote any state subsidy in order to underwrite that kind of a profit margin. They haven't told us what the goals are, and I would like to know, but I do not support providing any kind of subsidy for a casino. If the Senecas are doing something wrong, then we should address that. And if they're not doing something wrong, then Del Lago can't hang their hats on that. But I think that this is not the kind of industry where the state should be putting its money for economic development.
Okay. Senator, you'll have 1 minute on this.
So in terms of economic development for Seneca County and my opponent's county as well, Wayne County, they get significant funding from Del Lago. They're receiving that now. And that allows them to help with programs, whether it's drug addiction programs, whether it's supporting the Office of the Sheriff, whatever, they do get funding. So there is some financial benefit to several counties. In addition, the infrastructure improvements that were put in place when Del Lago was built have been significant and have driven additional development in the Seneca County area. Talking about the racinos and gambling and the impact on the community, the payments again to the county are huge. They're significant. They also employ thousands of people, and they help the farmers in our area stay in business. They help the feed stores, they help the hardware stores, so they're not all bad.
You'll have 1 minute.
I didn't say they were all bad, but they're not economic development engines. We've learned, if nothing else, we've learned from Atlantic City that yes, there's an immediate benefit to the immediate area, but there's a time lag, but then you get the negatives. You get more people losing their paychecks at the casino. They wind up more people on public assistance. There's an increase in spousal abuse, and the benefits do not reflect into the community. For every business that goes into the casino, there's one lost in the community. There's a time lag on this, and we haven't seen that yet, but we will. They've got a track record that is just not real good, and I do not want to put any state funds behind that.
Okay, Senator, you'll have another minute.
I would just say that in the instance of the Racino that's located in Farmington, they have been around, I believe, for more than 20 years. They've helped to drive business in that area. I support that type of business. Supporting giving Del Lago a handout or a payment because they're not meeting their numbers, no. Supporting Looking at the whole picture, as I said originally though, how if you do something for one casino, it impacts the OTBs, which provide funding to all of our counties. It impacts, there's a ripple effect, and it's not a simple issue. You have to look at it. You have to look at what's being proposed by the casino, what's the governor talking about, what are the devil's in the details. You have to search that, figure it out, and then make an educated decision.
We'll move on. Mr. Boyer.
I don't want to move on from gambling, though.
Okay.
So, no, I did have, since we're on that
Put it
topic.
all on red.
Yeah, there is the possibility it may come up in the next legislative session about whether to legalize sports betting in New York State, now that the U.S. Supreme Court has basically given states the blessing to make that decision. So what do you think? Should New York State jump into that industry and legalize sports betting?
Okay, I believe it is Mr. Baldridge's turn first for 2 minutes.
I guess I'm trying to think of some nice words to say about that, but I just think that that's not an industry that we want to encourage. It's not productive. It doesn't produce for the economy the way agriculture would, or manufacturing, or anything else. It's simply a transfer of money usually from the poor to the rich. Sports betting will be no exception. And it might pass, but I don't think that I would vote for it.
Senator, you have 2 minutes on sports betting.
Again, I'm going to go back to the devil is in the details. The sports betting bill that was tossed around towards the end of session, I could not support because it was going to have a negative impact, or a potentially negative impact on some of our other outlets, for instance, the racino. I think if we're going to have sports betting, the casinos, the racinos, the OTBs, and everyone need to get together and figure out how it could be beneficial for everyone. If that were the case, I would support sports betting.
Mr. Boyer.
Okay, one more issue I would like to jump back to in the district, and that is, and you touched on it, Senator Helming, with the flooding that we saw up on the Lake Ontario shoreline. The Plan 2014, we've heard a lot of debate about the wisdom of that, whether that contributed to the problems we saw, or whether it was just a terrible coincidence in that the first year it went into effect we had historic rainfall. So the question for both of you going forward is, as an advocate for that region, do you advocate for tossing 2014 out the window, revamping it, keeping it as is? Kind of give me your thoughts on that as a advocate for that area.
Okay, Senator Helming, you're up first.
So during the flooding, I spent quite a bit of time in Wayne County, Monroe County, and also Cuba County, where the flooding hit the worst. And I've talked to a lot of the locals. I hosted a forum. I had the president of the IJC, local folks, elected officials, people who are considered experts on Plan 2014. I truly believe that it's both, Jeremy. It was a coincidence that we had that record rainfall the first year that the plan was implemented, but I also believe that the Plan 2014 is also at fault and should be revised. If you look at the threshold for releasing water from the lake, it's at the same point that flooding occurs at Sodas Point. So as long as that threshold stays the same, they're always going to have flooding at Sodas Point, and I believe the other area may be Fairhaven. I have a meeting coming up. I believe it's in 2 weeks. It's going to be held at Sodas Point to talk about the plan itself. The IJC will be represented there, DEC, and so many others. There's a lot to do. And one thing that I find terribly disturbing is that plan was approved by our federal representatives and in November or December. So there was no time for the state to react and to say, hey, wait a minute, there's not enough time to put mitigation measures in place. So we're also working on that right now, figuring out, we're still trying to evaluate what mitigation measures are needed. I believe we're going to have terrible flooding again if we have the rainfall and if the thresholds aren't changed.
Thank you. Mr. Baldridge.
Thank you. This may be another area where we agree. Prior to the adoption of Plan 2014, the Wayne County Board did take up the issue and did pass a resolution asking that it not be adopted. I voted in support of that resolution. We were unanimous on that. We had experts come in and talk to us and talk to us about the lake levels and the decision points about when they trigger points when they start releasing more water. And it was clear from that discussion that the whole decision-making structure was going to be too little too late. even in a normal year. So we oppose that. I oppose that. Thought that it should not be adopted at all. The plan we've had in place for 50 years or so has been working just fine. There are other ways to take care of the muskrats, if that's your concern. So we argued collectively that it should not be done. It was passed. It did play out just as everyone had feared. And I think that there's no particular reason to think that it won't play out that way again. Whether it's a heavy snow melt or rain or some other combination of factors, the plan itself doesn't create flooding, but it allows flooding more easily than before. And I think it should be repealed, the previous plan put back in place. And then if we want to deal with some environmental issues, we can do that. And I'd be glad to help with that. But this is the wrong plan for us. That said, going forward, whatever plan we have, we're going to be dealing with a constant issue of lakeshore erosion all along the south shore of Lake Ontario. So when we think about what we're going to do with Plan 2014 or its successor, we also have to have a plan forward for the entire South Lake Shore. It's all eroding away, and this is just one more aspect of it.
Okay, Senator, you'll have 1 minute.
So, there are people who talk about doing things, like my opponent, and there are people who actually do things, like me. So at all the meetings that have been post-flooding on Plan 2014, whether it was the big forum that I held with the IJC, Kenan's colleagues, and so many others who came to testify, or whether it was the more grassroots local meetings that we've had with residents to talk about impacts. We've held those meetings numbers and numbers of times. I have never once seen my opponent at a single meeting. During the pre-flooding, when I was doing little video clips and talking about to the governor, sending messages that, hey, this is going to flood, it's only a matter of time, help us out here, never saw my opponent. During the sandbagging efforts, and when there are problems in the county getting sandbaggers and et cetera, and all of us working together, never saw my opponent. So he could talk all he wants about his plan and what he's going to do, but the time is now. He's a local town supervisor, and he's a member of the Wayne County Board of Supervisors. He has power. He can do things now.
Thank you, Senator.
It's interesting.
You'll have 1 minute.
Well, I didn't know I had that much power. We work collectively through the Board of Supervisors, and our chairman, who is our spokesman, also the supervisor of that town. What the senator couldn't see was that I was talking behind the scenes with the mayor of Sodas Point, asking what I could do to help him if he needed to evacuate people or sandbags or any equipment, working behind the scenes, and Rose did send resources to that facility. So there's more than meets the eye, and I think it's a bit low.
Okay.
I think it's accurate.
Okay. Well, we're going to just identify right now. You're watching the 54th Senate Forum here at Community College, sponsored by the college and the Citizen. We have both candidates for the 54th here. We have Senator Pam Helming, who is on the Republican, Conservative, Independence, and Reform lines, and her challenger, Rose Supervisor Kenan Baldridge, who's on the Democratic Women's Equality Party and Working Families Party. They are being asked questions by Jeremy Boyer, the executive editor of The Citizen. Mr. Boyer.
All right, thank you. I think Mr. Baldridge referred to solid waste management and that issue, and it's one that actually comes right over here into Auburn because the landfill, which I believe is even in the district, the landfill itself, has a limited shelf life. It's going to be winding down here in a few years, so Auburn's going to have to figure out where all its solid waste is going to go. So with that debate going on, and especially in the Seneca County area, what are your thoughts on what plans we need to have as we decide how to mitigate, the impacts it has on local communities?
Okay, Mr. Baldridge, you're up first. 2 minutes.
Thank you. We all generate waste, unfortunately. We generate too much. My argument has been that really at the state level, we need to adopt a zero waste policy. And then we need to back it with follow-on actions where we try very hard to prevent waste from occurring in the first place. And there are many ways to do that we don't have time to get into. But if we adopt that strategy, and especially if New York City will adopt that strategy, then we have less waste to contend with in the first place. That said, there probably will be some. And then I think we need to transition to state-of-the-art recycling facilities. We're technically capable of recycling more than we are at the present time, and some of that has to do with economics. These items are traded as commodities, so they have value, and we can take actions at the state level to increase the value in terms of bringing them into new products, particularly those that the state buys. And I think we should collectively, as the Finger Lakes, adopt a strategy of making this area the best practice area for recycling, not just standard, but best practice, and reduce the amount that we actually have to think about landfilling. And particularly, we need to stop importing it from other locations. So that's a good start, but these require policy decisions at the state level, which are then followed with actions by particularly the DEC and local governments. I think we don't need to have these big landfills. I think they should transition on schedule. They all have closure dates, and I think we should hold to those, transition them to state-of-the-art facilities, and then cover them over with solar arrays. Town of Williamson did it. They have a solar farm on their closed landfill. We could do it with these as well, and then we've made some real step forward.
Okay. On landfill, Senator, you have 2 minutes.
So my opponent talks about doing more with recycling, and my question is, what have you done in your community to do more to reduce waste? His waste from his community goes into those landfills. As a town supervisor myself, I instituted a significant recycling program that drove down the tonnage of waste that was going into the landfill. We recycled everything from scrap metal to clothing to you name it. So I would suggest again that there are people who talk about doing things and there are people who actually do things. So this past year there still is a proposal on the table in Romulus to build an incinerator. That would bring thousands and thousands of additional tonnage of waste from New York City into the Finger Lakes area. The proposed location is so close to Seneca Lake. It's also basically on the shore of Cayuga Lake. It's 3,200 feet from the Romulus School District. I worked extremely hard bringing together adversaries at the state level, the Business Council, the independent power producers, the environmental advocates, and so many more to say we need to come up with legislation that we can pass that would prevent this incinerator from being built here. And we were successful in doing that. I was able to get that legislation passed unanimously through the state Senate at the end of the session at a time that was very controversial and not a lot was moving. We should have had it passed in the Assembly. I worked with Energy Chair Michael Cusick, again working across party lines. He carried the bill. We were able to get the environmental advocates to give it 2 tree ratings, which means it's a good bill. And we were able to get the governor to come out and say that he was opposed to the incinerator, but we could not get that bill brought, and I shouldn't say we couldn't, I have no control over it, but the Assembly could not get that bill brought to the Assembly floor. It's still unknown to me why. I don't know why, what politics were involved. I'm still hoping that before the end of this year, we'll be called back by the governor for a special session and that bill will be passed by the Assembly. Very quickly, I just want to say that this is another area where communities all around, counties, towns, businesses wrote letters in support of my legislation. I have not received a resolution, a letter in opposition, nothing from my opponent.
Thank you, Senator. Mr. Baldridge, you have 1 minute if you wish it.
I would. Thank you. Our town works collectively with the other towns in the county, and we do have an active recycling program. We have had for many years, going back to the 90s, I think. And I don't know how many tons it is, but down the street you'll find the recycling bins out there, all sorted and recycled. So that's been going on for some time. That's not new.
And just to clarify your position on the incinerator?
I'm not in favor of the incinerator. I don't think we need the additional trash into the Finger Lake. They're not talking about incinerating things that go to Seneca Meadows. They're talking about bringing in additional trash, and I just don't think we need that. If the incinerator is so environmentally sensitive, then maybe it should be in Manhattan, where the trash originates. So,
I just want to say, to point out, because my opponent talked about state policies, he talked about adopting a zero waste policy. The state does have an adopted policy. It's called Beyond Waste, and it drives the state to that zero waste. However, and this is something that I'm working with the DEC on and pushing the governor on, is that report has very specific guidelines that, you know, by 2020 we will meet this goal, by 2022 we'll be at this goal. But there's no report back to the legislature. We don't know how is the state doing with that. I feel like I know, because in the district that I represent, we have the 3 largest landfills in New York State, if not the northeastern US. So there's a lot to be done. We need to have more accountability, more transparency. But I get a little bit nervous when my opponent talks about building recycling plants. The recycling market right now is collapsed. There's no money right now in recycling, so building plants, I don't know who would fund that. I don't know where, you know, what would be done with the products. I think that's a challenge for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to keep you all to your 2 minutes or 1 minute. Mr. Baldridge, anything?
The state DEC does have a program for solid waste management, and in their own report they acknowledge that it's not being funded and implemented as well as they would like. So that really, to me, to my way of thinking, falls on the legislature and the administration to make that happen. This is not rocket science. It's known. It just has to be implemented.
Senator, you get the last minute on this question, then we'll go back to Mr. Moyer.
Okay. Just on the topic of funding for state agencies like the DEC. So every year during the budget process, there are budget hearings. My opponent can send a letter saying that he wants to see more money for funding for the DEC. He could take that legislation or a proposed resolution to his county and ask them to put that forward. I sit at all of those budget hearings, whether I'm on the committee or not. And when you ask a commissioner, like the commissioner of the DEC, do you need more funding? Oftentimes, they won't give you a direct answer. And I believe it's because they've been told by the governor not to ask for more money.
Mr. Boyer.
Okay, a few other statewide issues. Hopefully we can get through. Keep in mind, the more you go back and forth, the less variety we get to, but that's up to you. I did want to ask, though, about a few things. One is the Child Victims Act, because that's a piece of legislation that has not gotten through the Senate, and despite getting through the Assembly a few years, and it's gaining a lot of discussion again, I think, heading into next year. Basically, the bottom line of it is it extends the statute of limitations for child abuse, sex abuse victims to be able to bring forward civil and or criminal charges. Where do you stand on that piece of legislation, and explain why?
Senator, I believe it is your turn to go first on the Children's Victims Act.
The Children Victims Act, I don't think it goes far enough. I think that the state government needs to do something, but I'm more in favor of, and I'm a co-sponsor of the Child Victims Fund, where the Child Victims Act only extends the age that you can report the statute of limitations by 5 years. The fund doesn't have a limit on it. The Child Victims Fund also establishes a funding mechanism for all children, where the Child Victims Act, to me it seems like that may work for children who have been sexually abused or preyed upon by someone who has been employed by an organization. But I think that the research shows that most children who are abused, it's done by family members. And those children or young adults now would be left out under the CVA. Under the Child Victims Fund, they would receive fair compensation. I think it's disgusting. I think sexual predators should be thrown in prison and the key should be tossed away. I think that we should do more. We should hold people accountable. The Child Victims Fund also does that. It mandates additional reporters. Clergy are included. I support the Child Victims Fund, and I support getting something done in this legislative session. Candidly, we should have done it this past session.
Thank you, Senator. Mr. Baldridge, on this issue of the Children's Victim Act, you have 2 minutes.
Thank you. In general, I would support that. I wouldn't argue too much about the statute of limitations, because there are some crimes that have no limit. Homicide, as I recall, has no limit on that, so this could be another one of those. Of course, the further away you get from the alleged event, the more difficult it becomes to prove. So that's a bit of a problem on the accuser, but I don't see any reason to have a legal impediment for bringing that report to hopefully bring justice.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Boyer.
Okay, another one is the New York Health Act. That's a proposal for universal health care, state-run universal health care. Tell us your positions on that.
Okay, and I think this is Mr. Baldridge first.
Thank you. I've been asked that a lot. I've had over 30 years in healthcare and human services, and I really endorse the goal of finding health insurance for everyone so that everyone gets health care when they need it. I could cite examples for why I feel that way, but you don't have time right now. But I have not been any more than lukewarm for this particular bill because I have looked at it, and I have looked at some analyses of it, and even the most favorable analysis of this bill says that it's going to cause the early layoff of 40,000 New Yorkers, and that is a concern to me. That's a bad start for any bill. I also think that they have overestimated the savings estimates they think they're going to get from it, and there's nothing really in there to contain some of the cost drivers in the healthcare industry that they're not mentioned in that bill at all. So I've not been wild about that. 95% of New Yorkers have health insurance. That's the figure I've seen. I think we should spend our time focusing on the 5% who don't, rather than trying to change the insurance company for the 95% who do. And I think there are probably better ways to do that than the New York Health Act. But I'm committed to the goal of making sure that everyone has health insurance. It's really important.
Thank you. Senator, you'll have 2 minutes on this subject as well.
Okay, so in its present form, I do not support the Universal Health Care Act. And as far as making sure that everyone has health insurance, to me, it goes beyond that. We have to make sure that people, I hold a number of mobile office hours. I travel all around the 6 counties and hold town hall mobile office hours. And one of the concerns that comes up, it's typically from self-employed people. And they talk about, they're mandated to have health care coverage, so they do. They buy the high deductible plans. But then they can't afford to go to the doctor because of the cost of those high deductibles. But the universal health care bill that the Assembly's passed, I think it's irresponsible to pass that when you have no idea what the actual fiscal implications are. The Rand Corporation study, I read through the study. I think you could play that either way you want, depending on which side of the fence you're on. But it does clearly state, even with the assumptions that they've made, that it would triple our state taxes. So I don't think that's the right answer.
Thank you, Mr. Boyer.
All right. Let's ask you about the SAFE Act, because that continues to be an issue of controversy. It's obviously law, but there's been a lot of push from some people pro-Second Amendment, especially who want to see it either repealed or considerably modified. So I'd like to know where you each stand on potential changes to that.
Okay, Senator, you're up first.
So, and this goes back to my opponent's opening statement when he said that I voted against the SAFE Act 4 times. So the SAFE Act was passed in 2013. Obviously, I wasn't a state senator at that time. I was a town board member, and I brought before our town a resolution saying we should call on the governor of the state of New York and the legislature to repeal the SAFE Act. So he is, I guess, sort of correct, but that's the kind of misinterpretation that we don't need more of in Albany. My stance on the SAFE Act, you can look at the bills that I sponsor. I sponsor a bill that says we should repeal the New York State SAFE Act, but we should preserve that provision that protects our first responders. I'm a co-sponsor on a bill that says, hey, New York City, you want to keep the SAFE Act? It's yours. We don't want it here in upstate, repeal it in upstate New York. So on the SAFE Act, I think I don't support it. I support that West Webster provision, but I think the governor is attempting to make more gun grabs, and it doesn't do anything to make our communities safer. It just takes away law-abiding, responsible gun owners' rights and their ability to own certain guns. My opponent also mentioned a bill that's been sexily touted as a domestic violence bill. That bill was built into the budget. That's policy. That should be discussed separately. And if that was a good bill, it would have done more for domestic violent victims. But it did nothing more than was already in the law. What it did, it expanded the definition of domestic violence misdemeanors, and it expanded the definition of domestic violence. It did nothing more to help women, and it didn't stand the test of daylight hours. I was given that bill at 10:33 p.m. on the night we were voting for it. We voted for it at 1 a.m. or something. There was no time to get feedback from anyone. It was a bad bill, and it was a last-minute deal that was made with the governor. It was wrong. It passed with a message of necessity. It couldn't even stand on its own. And the only reason why it came as a standalone bill is because I refused to vote on it in the budget. 17 of us stood strong on that, and it was pulled out of the budget. It's wrong. And to
Thank you, Senator.
all right.
Mr. Baldridge, you'll have 2 minutes or more on the SAFE Act.
Thank you. Just to clarify, the senator stood before the Wayne County Board of Supervisors at the August meeting at the fairgrounds last year and stated that she voted 4 times to repeal the SAFE Act. That's the source of the information. But to your question, just a little background, I'm a member of the NRA. I'm a hunter, I'm a gun owner. I believe in the Second Amendment, but I also believe that we should have the right to walk down the street in safety. And we need some common sense approaches to this whole business about firearms in society. One of that includes bump stocks. We don't need bump stocks, but bump stocks are still legal in New York. There is no civilian purpose for a bump stock. We should have universal background checks. We are close to that in New York, but not entirely. But we don't need some of the provisions of the SAFE Act. I like some of them. I don't like others. I like the Westchester provision. I like the domestic the provision where you can take firearms out of the house of a where domestic abuse has occurred. I think there should be a warrant requirement there because there's a Fourth Amendment issue involved. But there are other provisions that are not particularly wild. So I think we need to have a more discerning approach to this problem than just one bill, yes or no, and that doesn't seem to have happened. So,
Senator, you'll have 1 minute.
So one of the reasons why I'm opposed to the SAFE Act is the way it was passed, in the middle of the night using a message of necessity. You know what, as elected officials, we should be more transparent than that. There should be accountability involved. And if we're going to have a discussion, it needs to include everyone who is involved. The New York State Sheriff's Office would talk about how they weren't consulted before the SAFE Act was passed. So many in law enforcement weren't. And again, on the issue of transparency and accountability, you've got to be willing to stand up in Albany and say, hey, I haven't had enough time to look at that, I haven't had time to read that, I'm not going to act on it. When I was a town supervisor, transparency and accountability were foremost on my list of priorities. You could go to my website and see everything and anything that we were working on. Financials, budgets, didn't matter what it was. I tried to go onto my opponent's website, but I don't know. I don't even think he has one. So on the issue of transparency, I'm not surprised that he would be in favor of the way the SAFE Act was passed, because he just doesn't seem to operate under transparent conditions.
Mr. Baldridge, you'll have 1 minute.
well, we'll agree on one point. I was not a fan of the way the SAFE Act was passed. I don't believe a message of necessity was the correct way to go on that, and I said so in the Board of Supervisors meeting several years ago when it was passed. As for the Town of Rose website, we don't have one. It's an economic decision. I do write articles for the paper periodically. I don't think the Citizen gets one. You could if you wanted it, but the others are there for all to read, and the minutes are distributed in the community. So, but as for the SAFE Act, just quickly, I'm a former paramedic, and I've been in the homes where these women have been beaten up, knocked around, thrown against the wall, and so on. And it's always bloody, and it's never good. and it's not hard to imagine what would happen if there were a firearm in the house. So that's a part of the SAFE Act that should remain and possibly be strengthened. And there was an opportunity to strengthen that by take-back provision where there's been an order of protection given, and my opponent voted against that. And I think that's just wrong. So.
Senator Helming, you'll have 1 minute.
So there is something that we can do, and the Senate has done for the past 7 years, and I've been proud to sponsor the bill for the last 2 years, and that's passed Brittany's Law, which would help. It would create a database with domestic violent offenders. It would help in our quest to stop domestic violence, or at least to give people a fair warning. But that bill never gets brought to the floor in the Assembly. That was brought up at the same time the domestic violence bill that my opponent's talking about. They should have been married together. We should have done something concrete and specific to help women and men who suffer from domestic violence. Also on the issue of domestic violence, I'm proud to say that working with the Safe Harbors group, that we will be opening a shelter for victims of domestic violence. And also on domestic violence, we should be doing more to keep people in jail longer. During bail discussions, we need to do more. When people go in, they're charged with domestic violence crimes or actions, and they're released within 24 hours. It doesn't give a woman or someone who's abused time to find secure and safe housing.
Thank you, Senator. Okay, Mr. Boyer, you have one last question that we'll give each candidate 1 minute for.
Oh, okay. Well, let's solve Albany's corruption problems in 1 minute each. But I would like to, you can't do a debate without touching on that. Senator Helming, you referred to the most recent indictment that came down last week, a bribery case up in the Rochester area. So if you can just give me your priorities as we look to next year. We've heard about term limits, campaign finance reform, outside income limitations, just a few of the ideas that have been tossed out that haven't actually been acted upon or become law. So where would you start if you could have the power to clean up Albany?
We're going to give you 1 minute, and we're going to keep you to 1 minute so we can get your closing statements in. Supervisor Baldridge, please.
Okay, I would start with a couple of items. I think we really need to exclude outside income for not just senators but assemblymen. I think if you go to Albany, you have one job to do, and that's to represent the people. The outside income is an opportunity for other organizations to try to make you serve a different master, and I think that's not the way to go. I think we should also have certain pension forfeiture. If someone's convicted of corruption, that they should not be getting their pension check in jail. And I think we should close the LLC loophole so that people, everyone has to follow the campaign contribution limits and can't hide behind a limited liability corporation. I think those are three good places to start for ethics. Now, really, the solution is to hire ethical people. That's not something you can pass into a law. It's something the public has to do. But that's where I would start.
Senator, you'll have 1 minute on this.
I agree with what my opponent has said. I think also term limits are incredibly important, and I think we should start there. I think my frustration with corruption comes from, we talk about it a lot, but what are we actually able to do? We need to get the leaders together from the Senate, the Assembly, and the governor and actually come to some agreement that we can pass and we could actually do something. Every time the subject of term limits comes up, it passes in the Senate, it fails to get any steam in the Assembly. I think too, it goes back to researching the candidates. I don't know. Jeremy, this is a question that comes up all the time. I don't know if you've ever heard anything creative or different or what you think about asking this question year after year after year. And
I just asked the questions.
We'll now move over to your closing statements. As we said, we're going to give you each 2 minutes to close. There, by the draw of the lot, Senator Helming will go first. She's on the Republican, Conservative, Independence, and Reform line. Senator, you have 2 minutes.
Thank you. My priorities as a state senator are driven by what's important to the voters. In order to better understand your priorities, I spend as much time as possible engaged with the community. That includes hosting mobile office hours and town hall meetings. To date, I've held 14 throughout the district. By utilizing email, social media, petitions, surveys, and U.S. postal mailings, I am also able to engage with constituents. The feedback I've received has been absolutely incredible. Whether it's responses to a mailing on hunting, Lyme disease, ethics, cancer awareness, or the drug epidemic, your feedback has guided my decision making. For my work on your behalf, I've been inducted into the New York State Farm Bureau Circle of Friends, named Farm Family Advocate of the Year by FarmNet, and just recently recognized by the New York State Association of Dairy Officers with a Civic Leadership Award. Working to protect our lakes and our natural environment, I have been recognized by the New York Conservation Districts and earned an approval rating of 95% by the League of Conservation Voters, the second highest score of all state legislators. Endorsing my candidacy are law enforcement organizations such as the Finger Lakes PBA and the New York Conference of Police, numerous business organizations, watchdog groups like Unshackle Upstate, and labor organizations such as the AFL-CIO. However, the most important endorsement to me is yours. On November 6th, I'd be honored to have your vote. I'm running on 4 lines: Republican, Conservative, Independence, and Reform. Guy and Jeremy, thank you again for this opportunity to participate in the Candidates Forum.
You're welcome, and thank you for your comments. Kenan Baldridge, who's on the Democratic Working Families Party and Women's Equality Party, who's the Rose Town Supervisor. You have 2 minutes as well.
Thank you. Although we enjoy finding negatives about our opponents sometimes, it's really more important to find a way forward, to go down in Albany and do something positive. I think the place to start is, as just discussed, with serious ethics reform so that our legislators are actually working for us instead of the organizations that happen to have the most money. I've outlined 3 ways to start with that, and I think that that would be my first priority. After that, I think we need to take stock of our situation with the environment and see if we're really being good stewards of the land. We need to construct a way forward on that, and I think that means a policy decision to engage in best practice for land use and particularly recycling. We talked about the landfills. They need to be better than that. That is not the way forward. That's yesterday. I think also that if we intend to live in safety, we need to come to grips with gun violence. And that doesn't mean flailing the Second Amendment. It means protecting the Second Amendment. That's a bulwark against an overbearing government. But we need to live with that in a common sense way. And that means every right is paired with a responsibility. So we have to have some common sense gun laws to protect us. And lastly, I think we have to have full rights for women. We haven't had that until recently, and it's not complete even now. The Women's Reproductive Act was not passed. It needs to be, and that's part of the way forward so that women take their place in society as full and equal citizens. So in terms of style of a legislator, as a town supervisor, I do write columns, I get information out to people, and I'm out in the community all the time to meet people and give them an opportunity to talk with me about what concerns them. As a senator, I'll do the same thing all throughout the district. I'll go anywhere, talk to anybody. That's not a problem. I want to hear from people and talk with you about your concerns. And I see that my time is up, so thank you. And thank you to both of you, and I hope to have your support on Election Day.
Thank you both. We're delighted that you have been able to join us again in the studio, and we wish you well on the campaign trail. We know it's not always easy in this process, so we wish you well in the next couple of weeks. We want to thank Mr. Boyer for joining us again with his thoughtful questions. You can go online to see these forums if you're not watching them on Spectrum, Verizon, Fios, or on ARMA. You can go to auburnpub.com. They are there to be seen, as well as on the college's YouTube station, Media at Cayuga. We will be back with a couple of, just a quick couple of programming notes. We'll be back on Thursday with the candidates for Auburn City Court. We'll have Judge David Thurston and his opponent Stephen Bushman here to give 5-minute presentations. That is not Mr. Boyer's forte. They're just going to make their presentations to voters, and that'll be followed by an Inside Government with Justin Woods, the county administrator. We had hoped to kick off our season with him, but some scheduling items got in the way. So he'll be in the studio for an Inside Government. Next week, on Tuesday, October 23rd, Dana Balter will be in the studio for a 1-hour interview for the 24th congressional seat. She is challenging incumbent John Katko, who had been invited and was available to participate that day, but his campaign has not gotten back to us. At this point, unless both candidates show up. I will be asking Ms. Balter her questions. If you have questions, you can send them to Inside Government, 141 Dunning Avenue, Auburn, New York, 13021, or as usual, to cozguytho@aol.com. On Thursday the 25th, we hope to bring you the candidates for the 50th Senate District. John Mannion, who is running to replace Senator John DeFrancisco, who I mentioned at the top of the forum, is retiring, has agreed to participate. He's on the Democratic line, and we're hoping that he will be joined by his Republican opponent, Robert Antonacci. We'll finish off with our forums on Tuesday, October 30th, with the race for the 126th Assembly District that faces incumbent Assemblyman Gary D. Finch, a Republican, and his challenger, Cuyahoga County Legislator Keith Batman, who is a Democrat. Until Thursday, for Cuyahoga Community College and the Citizen, I'm Guy Cosentino. We hope you have a good night, and we hope to see you back here in the studio for the candidates and Mr. Woods on Thursday.